the small town of Redwood Hollow, a massive wildfire threatens to destroy everything in its path. Jackson Cole, a former firefighter battling PTSD, and his loyal German shepherd, Ember, step up to lead the fight against the flames. Together with Megan, a determined shop owner, and her brave son, Nathan, they rescue trapped families, fight to protect critical areas, and inspire a divided community to unite. Through daring rescues, heartbreaking sacrifices, and Ember's unwavering heroism, the town survives the fire and emerges stronger than ever. As Jackson and Ember leave Redwood Hollow to help other towns in need, their story becomes a powerful reminder of resilience, hope, and the extraordinary bond between man and dog. What did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to DG Story for more inspiring tales of courage and humanity. In the quiet town of Redwood Hollow, nestled at the foot of Northern California's majestic pine forests, life followed a slow and predictable rhythm. The townsfolk, a close-knit community of farmers, shop owners, and retirees, thrived in harmony with nature. But this summer was different. A relentless drought had turned the once lush forests into tinderboxes, and the air was dry and brittle. The threat of a wildfire loomed over Redwood Hollow like a shadow, a concern whispered in coffee shops and over backyard fences. Most dismissed it as a distant worry until the lightning storm. Late one afternoon, a single bolt of lightning sliced through the sky, striking deep in the forest. The impact ignited a fire that rapidly spread with the help of strong winds. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the once green forest was engulfed in flames, casting an eerie orange glow against the darkening sky. At the edge of town, Jackson Cole sat on the porch of his modest cabin, staring into the distant haze of smoke. A former firefighter and veteran of the Iraq War, Jackson had moved to Redwood Hollow to escape the chaos of his past. His cabin was his sanctuary, a place where he could quietly battle the demons of PTSD. Beside him lay Ember, his German shepherd. Ember wasn't just a pet. He was a service dog trained to help Jackson navigate his trauma. The dog's piercing amber eyes were always attentive, a silent anchor for Jackson when the memories became too overwhelming. As the smell of smoke grew stronger, Ember perked up, ears twitching. Jackson sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's far off," he muttered, more to himself than the dog. "It won't come here." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, in the center of town, Megan Harris, the owner of the local grocery store, was locking up for the day. Her son, Nathan, a lanky 16-year-old with a mop of dark curls, was waiting outside. "Mom, look!" Nathan pointed toward the hills. In the fading light, the fiery glow was unmistakable. Megan's heart sank. "We need to tell Sheriff Carter," she said, grabbing her phone. Within minutes, the town square became a hub of activity. Sheriff Carter, a burly man in his 50s with a steady demeanor, was coordinating with local volunteers. But it was clear the town wasn't prepared for a fire of this magnitude. "We don't have enough resources," Carter admitted to Megan. "We've called for backup, but they're hours away. If this fire moves faster than we expect." Megan nodded grimly. She knew what he wasn't saying. The town could be lost. As dusk turned to night, the fire began its relentless march toward Redwood Hollow. Megan's mind raced. She thought of Jackson, the reclusive man on the outskirts of town. She knew of his past as a firefighter and the stories of his bravery. If anyone could help, it was him. Without hesitation, she drove to his cabin, Nathan in tow. Jackson was startled by the sound of tires crunching on his gravel driveway. He stepped out onto the porch, Ember at his side. As Megan and Nathan approached, "Jackson," Megan called, urgency in her voice. "We need your help." Jackson frowned. "What's going on?" "The fire. It's moving toward town," she explained quickly. "Sheriff Carter is doing what he can. but we're overwhelmed. We need someone who knows how to handle this." Jackson's jaw tightened. Memories of another fire, another crisis, flashed through his mind. Flames, screams, the unbearable heat. He shook his head, stepping back. "I'm not that guy anymore," he said, his voice flat. "I can't do it." Nathan, wide-eyed and desperate, spoke up. "But you have to. People could die." Jackson looked at the boy, then at Megan. He saw the fear in their eyes, the hope that he could be the hero they needed. He opened his mouth to refuse again when Ember suddenly barked, sharp and insistent. The sound jolted Jackson. Ember never barked unless it was urgent. The dog's ears were pricked, his body tense as he stared toward the horizon. "Something's wrong," Jackson muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Without another word, he grabbed his old firefighting gear from the shed. "Let's go." As they drove back toward town, Jackson's mind raced. He had sworn never to step into another fire again. But the desperation in Megan's voice and the bark of his loyal companion had stirred something in him. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. And though it scared him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this fire wasn't just a threat. It was a call to action. The town of Redwood Hollow was already cloaked in smoke when Jackson, Megan, and Nathan arrived. The glow of the flames on the distant hills cast an ominous red hue over the town square, where a growing crowd of anxious residents had gathered. Sheriff Carter stood at the center of the chaos, barking orders and directing volunteers to load supplies onto trucks. Jackson stepped out of the car, his old firefighting jacket slung over his shoulder. Ember leapt out after him, alert and scanning the crowd. Megan hurried over to Sheriff Carter, who turned to Jackson with a mix of surprise and relief. "Didn't think I'd see you here, Cole," Carter said, his voice gruff but appreciative. "We're stretched thin. Every set of hands counts." Jackson nodded but kept his response short. "What's the situation?" Carter pulled out a hastily marked map of the area, the red ink outlining the path of the fire as it crept closer to the outskirts of town. "The fire's moving fast, too fast. It's already jumped the creek here," he said, pointing to a spot just a few miles out. "We've evacuated most of the homes in its path, but some folks refused to leave." Jackson frowned. "Why?" "Stubbornness. Mostly," Carter replied. "Or they think it won't reach them." Jackson exhaled sharply. He'd seen this before. Some people didn't believe in danger until it was staring them in the face. "Fine," he said, glancing at the map. "We'll start here." He tapped a section on the map where a small cluster of homes bordered the forest. "Those houses will go up in minutes if the wind shifts. We need to get them out now." With Carter's blessing, Jackson took the lead on the first rescue mission. He and Ember climbed into the back of a volunteer's truck, while Megan and Nathan followed in her car. As they neared the outer edges of town, the air grew thick with smoke, stinging their eyes and throats. Jackson pulled his jacket tighter, the weight of his old gear both comforting and heavy with memories. Ember sat beside him, his body tense, ears swiveling at every sound. When they reached the first house, Jackson jumped out, quickly assessing the situation. Smoke was already curling under the eaves, and ash rained down like snow. He banged on the door. "Fire department. Is anyone inside?" There was no response at first, but then a faint voice called out, "Help! We're in here." Jackson motioned to Ember, who bolted toward the door, barking sharply. The sound seemed to galvanize whoever was inside. Moments later, an elderly man opened the door, coughing and clutching a small oxygen tank. "My wife? She's upstairs," he wheezed. Jackson didn't hesitate. "Get him to safety," he ordered Megan, who had just arrived. She nodded, helping the man to the car as Jackson and Ember dashed inside. The heat was oppressive, the smoke so thick it blurred his vision. Ember led the way, his keen nose guiding him up the stairs. They found the woman in a bedroom, sitting on the floor and clutching a photo album. She looked up, startled. as Jackson entered. "We have to go," he said, his voice firm but calm. The woman hesitated. "But my things." "No time," he interrupted, grabbing her arm gently but firmly. Ember barked, urging them forward. The woman relented, allowing Jackson to help her to her feet. Together, they descended the stairs, Ember leading the way. Outside, Megan and Nathan were already helping load the elderly man into the car. Jackson handed the woman off to Nathan, who steadied her as she climbed into the vehicle. "Next house," Jackson said, wiping sweat from his brow. The next house was eerily quiet, its windows dark. Jackson checked the front and back doors but found them locked. Ember, however, was pacing near the garage, his nose pressed to the ground. "What is it, boy?" Jackson asked. Ember barked, then pawed at the garage door. Jackson bent down, listening carefully. Faintly, he heard a muffled whimper. "There's someone in there," he muttered, scanning for a way in. Spotting a side window, he smashed it with a rock, clearing the broken glass before climbing through. Ember followed, his movements agile despite the confined space. Inside, they found a young girl, no older than 6, huddled in the corner with a small terrier. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face streaked with tears and soot. "It's okay," Jackson said softly, crouching to her level. "We're here to help." Ember approached slowly, his tail wagging gently. The girl hesitated but reached out to pet him, her trembling hand finding comfort in his soft fur. Jackson scooped her up, carrying her and the dog to safety. By the time they emerged from the garage, flames were licking at the edge of the property. "Go!" he shouted to Megan, who had just pulled up with the car. As they sped back toward town, Jackson glanced at Ember. The dog was panting, his fur streaked with ash, but his eyes were steady, unyielding. "Good work, buddy," Jackson murmured, scratching Ember behind the ears. But as they approached the town square, Jackson's sense of relief was short-lived. Sheriff Carter was waiting with grim news. "The winds shifted," Carter said, pointing toward a new plume of smoke rising on the horizon. "It's heading straight for the eastern edge of town." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Then we keep going." The eastern edge of Redwood Hollow lay in eerie silence, broken only by the distant roar of flames and the occasional crack of burning branches. The wind had shifted, pushing the fire dangerously close to the small, tightly packed neighborhood. From their vantage point in the fire truck, Jackson could see the first flickers of flame licking at the treetops. "This is going to spread fast," Jackson muttered, glancing at Ember, who sat alert beside him. The dog's nose twitched, picking up faint scents carried on the wind. Sheriff Carter's voice crackled over the radio. "Cole, I just got word. 2 families haven't evacuated from the east side. One of them's got kids. Think you can handle it?" Jackson's grip tightened on the radio. "We're on it." The team pulled up to a modest single-story house at the edge of the neighborhood. Smoke billowed in the distance, and ash drifted like snow in the humid air. Jackson stepped out, his firefighter's jacket heavy on his shoulders. Megan and Nathan followed close behind. Jackson knocked loudly on the door. "Fire department, is anyone inside?" There was no answer. Ember, however, had already circled around to the side of the house, his ears pricked and tail stiff. He barked twice, sharp and insistent. "He smells something," Jackson said, hurrying after the dog. At the back of the house, Ember stopped in front of a low window, pawing at the ground. Jackson peered inside and saw a woman sitting on the floor, her face buried in her hands. "She's in there," Jackson said, pulling out his flashlight and motioning for Megan. "Nathan, stay by the truck. Megan, follow me." The back door was locked, but Jackson forced it open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, stinging their eyes and throats. Ember led the way, weaving through the cramped living room and into the kitchen where the woman sat. "Ma'am," Jackson called, crouching beside her. "We're here to help. You need to get out of here." She looked up, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I can't leave," she said hoarsely. "My husband, he went to get the car. He hasn't come back." Jackson exchanged a quick glance with Megan. "We'll find him, but first, we need to get you outside." The woman hesitated, but Ember nuzzled her hand, his calm presence steadying her. She nodded, allowing Megan to help her to her feet. As they exited the house, a loud crack echoed through the air. Jackson turned just in time to see a burning tree branch collapse onto the yard, blocking their path to the truck. "Go around," Jackson shouted, pulling the woman toward the driveway. Ember barked, running ahead to scout the route. Nathan appeared on the other side of the fallen branch, waving frantically. "Over here." The group scrambled around the debris, coughing from the thickening smoke. As they reached the truck, Megan helped the woman into the back seat while Jackson scanned the area. "There's no sign of her husband," Jackson said, frustration tightening his voice. "Maybe he made it out already," Megan offered, but Jackson's instincts told him otherwise. Ember barked again, this time toward a two-story house further down the street. The flames were dangerously close, crackling as they consumed the dry grass in the front yard. "That one's next," Jackson said, already moving. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, the house was silent, save for the faint hum of an air conditioner struggling against the rising heat. "Hello," Jackson called. "Is anyone here?" A muffled cry came from upstairs. "Stay back," Jackson warned Megan as he bolted up the stairs, Ember close behind. On the second floor, they found a young boy, no older than 5, hiding in a closet. His tear-streaked face lit up when he saw Ember. "Hey, buddy," Jackson said gently, kneeling down. "We're here to get you out of here." The boy hesitated until Ember padded closer, wagging his tail. Slowly, the child reached out to pet him, his small hand trembling. Jackson scooped the boy up. "Anyone else in the house?" The boy shook his head, clutching tightly to Jackson's jacket. As they descended the stairs, a sudden roar filled the air. The fire had reached the side of the house, and flames licked at the windows. The heat was suffocating, the smoke blinding. "Move," Jackson shouted, shielding the boy's face as they ran toward the back door. Ember barked frantically, leading the way through the smoke-filled kitchen. At one point, the dog stopped abruptly, blocking Jackson's path. "What is it?" Jackson asked. Ember sniffed the air, then darted toward a corner of the room. Jackson followed and found a terrified cat huddled under a table. "You're kidding me," Jackson muttered, grabbing the cat by the scruff. With the boy in one arm and the cat in the other, Jackson followed Ember out of the house. Megan and Nathan were waiting at the truck, their faces etched with relief as Jackson emerged. "You got them?" Megan asked, helping Jackson load the boy and the cat into the truck. "Got them," Jackson confirmed, glancing back at the flames now engulfing the house. Back at the town square, Sheriff Carter met them with grim news. "The winds shifted again," he said, pointing to a new plume of smoke on the horizon. "It's heading straight for the elementary school." Jackson felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him, but he didn't hesitate. "Then that's where we're going next," Ember barked sharply, his tail wagging with renewed determination. The elementary school on the eastern edge of Redwood Hollow was the last refuge for a handful of families who had nowhere else to go. As the wind shifted again, the fire roared toward the school with terrifying speed, turning the safe haven into a potential death trap. Sheriff Carter's voice crackled urgently over the radio. "Cole, the fire's moving faster than we thought. We've got reports of at least 20 people still at the school, mostly kids. You need to get them out of there now." Jackson didn't respond immediately, his focus fixed on the glowing horizon. The smoke was darker now, a warning that the fire was feeding on heavier fuel, trees, homes, even vehicles. Ember sat beside him in the fire truck, tense but ready, his ears twitching at every distant sound. "Let's go," Jackson finally said, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. As they approached the school, The heat was already palpable, radiating from the forest just a few hundred yards away. The parking lot was chaotic, with a few cars still trying to leave and panicked parents shouting for their children. Jackson jumped out of the truck, immediately scanning the scene. Megan and Nathan followed close behind, while Ember darted toward the building, sniffing the air for signs of danger. Inside, the principal, a frazzled woman named Ms. Delgado, was trying to maintain order. A group of children sat huddled in the gymnasium, their faces pale and tear-streaked. "We need to move now," Jackson said firmly, addressing Ms. Delgado. "We've been trying," she said, her voice shaking, "but the smoke is everywhere, and some of the kids are too scared to leave." Jackson knelt in front of the children, his tone calm but commanding. "Listen to me, kids. I know you're scared, but we're going to get out of here together. This is Ember." He gestured to the German shepherd, who wagged his tail and approached the group with gentle curiosity. One of the younger boys reached out tentatively to pet Ember, and the dog licked his hand, eliciting a small, nervous giggle. "That's it," Jackson said, his voice encouraging. "We stick together. Follow Ember, and we'll all be safe." The group began moving through the hallways, guided by Jackson and Ember at the front and Megan at the rear. Nathan carried a toddler who clung to him tightly, her small hands clutching his jacket. The smoke grew thicker as they approached the main exit, and Ember stopped abruptly, barking sharply. Jackson's stomach sank. "What is it, boy?" Ember bolted down a side hallway, his bark echoing through the building. Without hesitation, Jackson followed, motioning for Megan to continue leading the group outside. At the end of the hallway, Ember pawed at a closed classroom door. From inside, Jackson could hear faint coughing and the muffled cries of a child. He shoved the door open to find a teacher and 2 students trapped, their faces pale and their movements sluggish from the smoke. "We didn't think anyone was coming," the teacher said, her voice barely audible. "We've got you," Jackson replied. "Stay low and follow Ember." The teacher helped one of the students to her feet while Jackson carried the other, a boy no older than 5 who clung to him with wide, frightened eyes. As they rejoined the main group, Jackson's radio crackled again. "Cole, the fire's at the edge of the parking lot," Carter's voice warned. "You've got maybe 5 minutes." Outside, the scene was chaos. Flames had reached the edge of the lot, consuming a row of abandoned cars. The heat was blistering, and the smoke turned the world into a gray, suffocating haze. "Move! Move!" Jackson shouted, ushering the children and parents toward the waiting vehicles. Ember darted back and forth, herding stragglers and barking sharply to keep the group moving. Megan helped Ms. Delgado lift a child into the back of a pickup truck, while Nathan guided the toddler he'd been carrying to safety. "Everyone accounted for?" Jackson asked, his voice hoarse. Ms. Delgado nodded, but then her eyes widened in panic. "Wait, the attendance sheet. I left it inside." Jackson's heart sank. "We don't have time." But before he could finish, Ember barked sharply and bolted back toward the building. "Ember, no!" Jackson shouted, running after him. The flames were at the edge of the building now, consuming the wooden exterior. Ember disappeared into the smoke, and Jackson followed blindly, his lungs burning with each breath. Inside the gymnasium, Ember pawed at a stack of papers on a desk. The attendance sheet lay beneath them, and the dog grabbed it carefully in his mouth. "You stubborn dog," Jackson muttered, grabbing Ember by the collar as they turned to leave. As they ran back outside, a loud crack split the air. Jackson looked up just in time to see part of the roof collapse, sending a shower of embers raining down. He threw himself over Ember, shielding the dog with his body as the debris fell around them. Moments later, Megan and Nathan appeared, pulling Jackson and Ember to their feet. The group stumbled toward the last vehicle, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. "You okay?" Megan asked, her eyes scanning Jackson for injuries. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was raw and his body ached. He patted Ember, who was panting heavily but otherwise unharmed. This guy saved the day. The truck roared to life, and the group sped away just as the fire consumed the building behind them. Back at the town square, the survivors were reunited with their families, tears and hugs replacing the earlier panic. Jackson stood off to the side, watching quietly as Ember lay at his feet, exhausted but alert. Sheriff Carter approached, clapping a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "Hell of a thing you did out there, Cole." Jackson shook his head. "It wasn't just me. Ember did half the work." Carter chuckled. "Then you're one hell of a team," as Jackson knelt to ruffle Ember's ears. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: pride. But there was no time to dwell on it. Carter's radio crackled again. "Sheriff, we've got reports of new hotspots near the southern edge of town." Jackson sighed, his resolve hardening. "Let's go." Ember barked softly, his tail wagging faintly as if to say, "I'm ready." The fire's relentless advance toward the southern edge of Redwood Hollow posed an even greater threat. This area wasn't just a cluster of homes. It housed the town's propane storage facility. If the flames reached it, the resulting explosion could level several city blocks. Sheriff Carter's voice came through the radio. "Cole, we need to stop that fire before it gets to the propane tanks. We've evacuated most of the area, but some people are still refusing to leave. You're our best shot." Jackson sat in the fire truck's passenger seat, his body aching from the past rescues. Ember lay at his feet, panting but alert. Jackson reached down, resting a hand on the dog's soot-streaked fur. "You've still got some fight left in you, don't you, boy?" Ember wagged his tail faintly, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Jackson nodded at Megan, who was driving. "Let's move." The southern edge of town was eerily quiet as they approached. The fire loomed in the distance, its glow illuminating the darkened streets. Embers floated in the air like fiery snowflakes, carried on the strong wind. Nathan, seated in the back of the truck, leaned forward. "Do you think we'll make it in time?" "We don't have a choice," Jackson said, his voice steady. "If we don't, the whole town's at risk." As they neared the propane facility, Ember suddenly stood up, his body tense. He barked twice, a sharp, urgent sound. "What is it, boy?" Jackson asked, following Ember's gaze. To their left, a small house sat dangerously close to the fire's edge. Flames licked at the surrounding trees, and smoke poured from the windows. "There's someone in there," Jackson said, already moving. Jackson and Ember approached the house, the heat growing more intense with each step. Megan stayed behind, ready to help evacuate anyone they found. Jackson banged on the front door. "Fire department, is anyone inside?" A faint voice answered from within. "Help, we're in here." Jackson forced the door open and found an elderly man and his wife sitting in the living room, both coughing and struggling to move. Ember darted ahead, sniffing and circling them as if to urge them to get up. "We need to get you out now," Jackson said, his tone firm but calm. "I can't walk," the man rasped, clutching his chest. Jackson didn't hesitate. He hoisted the man onto his shoulders, motioning for the woman to follow. Ember stayed close to her, nudging her forward whenever she faltered. As they exited the house, a loud crack echoed through the air. Jackson turned to see a burning tree branch collapse, blocking their path. "Back around," he shouted, leading them toward the rear of the property. Megan appeared, helping the woman climb over a low fence while Jackson carried the man. Ember darted ahead, his sharp barks cutting through the roar of the flames. They made it back to the truck just as the house collapsed in a fiery heap, with the elderly couple safely in the care of volunteers. Jackson and the team continued toward the propane storage facility. The fire was dangerously close now, the tanks visible through the thick smoke. Sheriff Carter's voice crackled over the radio. "Cole, the heat's too intense for us to get close. If those tanks blow..." Jackson cut him off. "We'll handle it." He turned to Megan and Nathan. "Stay here if this goes south. Get out of here as fast as you can." Nathan protested. But, no buts, Jackson said firmly. This is too dangerous. Jackson and Ember approached the facility, the air shimmering with heat. The metal tanks were glowing faintly, a warning sign that the fire was already affecting their structural integrity. Ember sniffed the ground, his movements deliberate. He stopped suddenly, barking toward a control valve on the far side of the facility. That's it, Jackson muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He made his way to the valve, his gloves barely able to shield his hands from the searing heat. Ember stayed close, his body tense as if he understood the gravity of the moment. As Jackson began turning the valve to cut off the gas supply, a loud boom shook the ground. One of the smaller tanks had ruptured, sending debris flying. The blast knocked Jackson off his feet, slamming him into the side of a nearby tank. Dazed and bleeding from a gash on his forehead, he struggled to push himself up. Ember barked frantically, darting back and forth. He grabbed Jackson's jacket with his teeth, pulling him away from the damaged tanks. Good boy, Jackson rasped, his vision blurry. The flames surged closer, their heat unbearable. Jackson gritted his teeth, using every ounce of strength to finish turning the valve. Finally, the gas flow stopped, and the remaining tanks hissed as the pressure began to stabilize. But their ordeal wasn't over. The fire had reached the facility's perimeter, and the structure was groaning ominously. Ember barked sharply, pulling at Jackson's jacket again. Together, they stumbled toward the exit, the flames chasing them like a living entity. As they neared the fence line, a section of the facility collapsed, sending a wave of heat and smoke surging toward them. Ember pressed against Jackson, shielding him from the worst of it as they stumbled through the gate. Megan and Nathan ran to meet them, their faces pale with fear. You did it, Megan exclaimed, helping Jackson to his feet. Thanks to him, Jackson said, resting a hand on Ember's soot-streaked fur. The dog wagged his tail weakly, his body trembling with exhaustion but his eyes still alert. As they drove back to the town square, Jackson leaned back against the truck's seat, his body battered and his mind racing. Ember lay beside him, his head resting on Jackson's lap. You're a damn hero. You know that, Jackson murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Ember's tail thumped once against the truck's floor, a faint but resolute reply. But as the glow of the fire receded behind them, Jackson knew their fight wasn't over yet. Back at the town square, the tension was palpable. The fire's advance had slowed thanks to Jackson and Ember's efforts at the propane facility, but it wasn't enough. Reports of flare-ups in multiple areas kept the volunteers and firefighters scrambling. Exhaustion hung heavy in the air, yet no one dared to stop. Jackson leaned against the fire truck, wiping soot from his face. Ember lay at his feet, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. Megan approached with a bottle of water, handing it to Jackson. You should rest, she said, her voice laced with concern. Jackson shook his head. Not yet. Sheriff Carter appeared, his face grim. We've got another problem, he said, pointing toward the southern edge of town. That warehouse near the industrial park, it's full of chemicals. If the fire reaches it, we're looking at another explosion. Jackson straightened, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Is it occupied? Not anymore, Carter replied. But if it goes up, it'll take out half the industrial park and spread the fire even further. The warehouse was in a precarious position, surrounded by dry grass and wooden pallets that were already smoldering. Jackson, Megan, and Nathan arrived just as a gust of wind reignited flames along the western wall of the structure. Do we even have a chance? Megan asked, shielding her face from the heat. We don't have a choice, Jackson said, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the truck. Nathan, stay here and keep watch. Megan, help me with the hoses. As they worked to contain the flames, Ember darted ahead, barking sharply. The dog's instincts had proven invaluable all night, and Jackson knew better than to ignore him. What is it? Boy, Jackson called, following Ember toward the rear of the warehouse. At the back of the building, Ember stopped. His ears pricked and his body tense. Jackson froze when he heard it. A faint, muffled cry. "Someone's in there," he muttered, his stomach sinking. Ignoring the heat radiating from the walls, Jackson pried open a side door and stepped inside. The air was suffocating, thick with smoke and fumes. Ember led the way, his sharp barks guiding Jackson through the haze. They found a man trapped under a fallen beam, coughing weakly as the flames crept closer. "Hang on," Jackson said, kneeling beside him. "We'll get you out." Ember circled the man, barking urgently as Jackson strained to lift the beam. The heat was unbearable, and every second felt like an eternity. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Jackson freed the man and helped him to his feet. "Go!" Jackson shouted, pointing toward the exit. The man stumbled out, guided by Megan, who had just arrived. But as Jackson turned to follow, a loud crack echoed through the building. A section of the ceiling gave way, sending a fiery cascade of debris crashing down. Jackson barely had time to react before Ember lunged at him, knocking him out of the way. The impact sent Jackson sprawling, his head hitting the floor. Dazed, he looked up to see Ember trapped beneath a burning plank. "Ember!" Jackson shouted, scrambling to his feet. The dog whimpered but didn't stop struggling, his paws clawing at the floor as flames closed in around them, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. Jackson rushed forward, lifting the plank with every ounce of strength he had left. "Come on, boy," he urged, his voice breaking. Ember managed to crawl free, but his movements were sluggish, his body battered and burned. Jackson scooped him up, cradling the dog in his arms as he stumbled toward the exit. The group burst out of the warehouse just as the flames engulfed the structure. Nathan ran to meet them, his face pale with worry. "Is he okay?" Nathan asked, his voice trembling. Jackson knelt, gently laying Ember on the ground. The dog's breathing was shallow, his fur singed and his paws raw. "He'll be okay," Jackson said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Megan quickly grabbed a first aid kit, tending to Ember's wounds with careful hands. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" she murmured, her voice soft. Ember wagged his tail faintly, his golden eyes meeting Jackson's. As the fire continued to rage in the distance, Jackson and his team returned to the town square. The sight of Ember's injuries stirred something in the crowd. People who had been hesitant to help earlier stepped forward, their determination renewed. "We can't let this fire take our town," one man said, his voice firm. "Jackson, what do we do next?" another volunteer asked. Jackson looked at Ember, who was now resting on a blanket, his spirit unbroken despite his injuries. "We fight," Jackson said, his voice steady. Together, with new volunteers joining the effort, the town began to organize a coordinated response. Fire breaks were dug, water lines were extended, and supplies were distributed. Despite his injuries, Ember insisted on staying close to Jackson, his presence a constant source of inspiration. As the night wore on, Jackson found a moment to sit beside Ember, running a hand through the dog's soot-streaked fur. "You've done enough for one night, buddy," Jackson said softly. "Rest now." But Ember's eyes remained sharp, as if to say, "We're not finished yet." The fire's relentless advance had pushed the town of Redwood Hollow to its breaking point. The coordinated efforts of the volunteers and firefighters had slowed the flames. But the danger was far from over. The largest flare-up yet had ignited along the western edge of the town, threatening to consume what remained of the community. Jackson stood at the edge of the town square, staring into the distance where the glow of the flames illuminated the horizon. Ember lay beside him, his body bandaged and battered, but his sharp eyes watching every movement. Sheriff Carter approached, his face etched with exhaustion. "We've got a real problem, Cole," he said, pointing to a hastily marked map. "If the fire reaches this line here," he tapped a road just a few miles from the center of town, "it'll sweep through the rest of Redwood Hollow. We won't be able to stop it." "What's the plan?" Jackson asked, his voice steady but grim. Carter hesitated. We've got one chance. There's an old firebreak on the west side of town. If we can clear it and set up a controlled burn, we might be able to stop the fire from spreading. Jackson nodded, his mind already racing. We'll need every volunteer we can get. And water, a lot of it. Carter sighed. The trucks are almost dry, but we've got enough for one last push. As Carter briefed the volunteers, Jackson stood before the crowd, his soot-covered face and commanding presence inspiring confidence. Ember stood at his side, his tail wagging faintly despite his obvious fatigue. "This is it," Jackson said, his voice firm. "If we don't hold that line, we lose everything. I won't lie to you, it's going to be dangerous. But if we work together, we can save this town." The crowd murmured with uncertainty, but then Nathan stepped forward. "I'm in," the teenager said, his voice clear and determined. "If Jackson and Ember can do it, so can we." Megan stepped up beside him. "Me too." One by one, others followed, until nearly the entire group had volunteered. Jackson nodded, a flicker of pride crossing his face. "Let's move." The firebreak was an overgrown dirt path that had been neglected for years, now choked with weeds and debris. Clearing it would be a monumental task, but it was the town's last hope. As the group worked tirelessly to clear the path, Ember darted back and forth, sniffing for hot spots and barking warnings whenever the fire grew too close. Nathan wielded a chainsaw, cutting down brush with surprising skill, while Megan coordinated water distribution among the volunteers. The fire roared in the distance, a living, breathing entity that seemed determined to consume everything in its path. Jackson directed the effort with practiced efficiency, his years of firefighting experience guiding every decision. Just as the firebreak was nearly complete, a gust of wind sent embers flying into the air. Several landed on the dry brush behind the group, igniting a new blaze that quickly spread toward their position. "Fall back," Jackson shouted, grabbing a shovel and throwing dirt onto the flames. The volunteers scrambled to contain the new fire, but it spread faster than they could extinguish it. Ember barked sharply, darting toward the edge of the brush line. "What's he doing?" Megan shouted, her voice laced with panic. "He's looking for a way out," Jackson said, his heart pounding. Ember's sharp instincts led him to a narrow path that cut through the trees. Barking urgently, he guided the group toward it. With Ember leading the way, the group made their way to the end of the firebreak. Jackson stayed behind with a handful of volunteers, working to create a final barrier. The heat was overwhelming, and Jackson's muscles ached with every movement. Ember returned to his side, his fur singed but his determination unyielding. "Almost there." "Boy," Jackson said, his voice hoarse. Finally, the last section of the firebreak was cleared. Jackson turned to Carter, who had arrived with the water trucks. "Start the controlled burn," Jackson ordered. Carter nodded, and the firefighters lit the brush along the edge of the firebreak. The flames spread quickly, creating a buffer zone that would deprive the approaching wildfire of fuel. As the controlled burn began to work, Jackson heard a faint cry for help. Turning, he saw a figure stumbling out of the smoke, a woman clutching a small child. "They didn't evacuate," Megan shouted, horror in her voice. Without hesitation, Jackson and Ember ran toward them. The woman collapsed just as Jackson reached her, the child crying in her arms. "I've got you," Jackson said, scooping up the child and helping the woman to her feet. Ember barked sharply, circling them protectively as they made their way back to safety. The fire closed in, but the controlled burn had begun to slow its advance, giving them just enough time to escape. As dawn broke over Redwood Hollow, the fire's advance had finally been stopped. The controlled burn, combined with the efforts of the firefighters and volunteers, had saved the town from total destruction. Exhausted but triumphant, the group gathered in the town square. Families hugged, tears of relief streaming down their soot-streaked faces. Jackson sat on the steps of the fire truck, Ember resting beside him, The dog's fur was singed, his body battered, but his eyes shone with quiet pride. Megan approached, handing Jackson a bottle of water. "We did it," she said, a tired smile on her face. "No," Jackson replied, glancing down at Ember. "He did it." The dog wagged his tail faintly, his golden eyes meeting Jackson's. As the town began to rebuild, Jackson reflected on the night's events. The fire had tested them all, but it had also brought the community closer together. And as he looked at Ember, Jackson knew that their bond, tested in the flames, was unbreakable. The fire that had threatened to destroy Redwood Hollow was finally under control. Ash blanketed the town like snow, and the acrid smell of smoke lingered in the air. The once vibrant forests surrounding the town were now a charred wasteland, their blackened remains standing as grim reminders of the inferno that had raged just hours earlier. Despite the devastation, the town square buzzed with activity. Volunteers worked tirelessly to distribute supplies. Firefighters took rare moments to rest, and families reunited in tearful embraces. The relief was palpable, but so was the weariness. Jackson stood near the fire truck, watching as the townspeople came together in ways he hadn't seen before. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings were now working side by side, sharing food and stories of survival. Megan approached with a small group of children, including Nathan. She held a tray of sandwiches, her face streaked with soot but alight with a tired smile. "You need to eat," she said, handing Jackson a sandwich. He hesitated, then accepted it with a nod. "Thanks." Nathan crouched beside Ember, who lay on a blanket with his bandaged paws stretched out. The dog's tail wagged faintly as Nathan gently stroked his fur. "You were amazing out there," Nathan said softly. "You saved us all." Ember licked Nathan's hand, his golden eyes filled with quiet understanding. As the day wore on, Sheriff Carter called for a brief gathering in the square. He stood atop the steps of the town hall, his voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. "We've been through hell and back," Carter began, his tone solemn, "but we made it because of the courage and determination of this community, and because of the people who stepped up when we needed them most." He gestured toward Jackson and Ember, who stood near the front of the crowd. Jackson Cole and his dog, Ember, led the charge. "They risked everything to protect us. Let's give them the thanks they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Jackson shifted uncomfortably, not used to the attention, but he couldn't help but smile as Ember barked softly, his tail wagging. Later that evening, as the sun set over the charred remains of the forest, Jackson sat on the steps of his cabin with Ember by his side. The dog's wounds had been treated, and though his body was battered, his spirit remained unbroken. Megan arrived, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Jackson and sat beside him, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, breaking the silence. Jackson stared out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "This town has a lot of rebuilding to do," he said, "but they don't need me for that. They've got each other now." Megan nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "And what about Ember?" Jackson glanced at the dog, who rested his head on Jackson's knee, his eyes half closed. "He's coming with me," Jackson said with a faint smile. "We've got more work to do." The next morning, as the town began the long process of rebuilding, Jackson loaded a few belongings into his truck. Ember sat in the passenger seat, his head poking out of the window as he watched the activity in the square. Nathan and Megan approached, their faces a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You're really leaving?" Nathan asked. Jackson nodded. "There are other towns out there that might need a hand, and I think it's time we put these skills to use somewhere else." Megan extended her hand, and Jackson shook it firmly. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Jackson looked at her, then at Nathan. "You two were just as much a part of this as I was. Don't forget that." As Jackson climbed into the truck, Nathan leaned down to give Ember one last pat. Take care of him, okay? Ember licked Nathan's hand, his tail wagging gently. As Jackson drove out of town, the morning sun cast a golden glow over the scorched landscape. The devastation was undeniable, but so was the resilience of the people who had faced it. Ember sat tall in the passenger seat, his ears perked and his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Jackson said, glancing at him. Ember barked softly, a sound of agreement and determination. The two of them disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a town forever changed, not just by the fire, but by the courage and hope that had risen from its ashes. And though their destination was uncertain, one thing was clear: wherever there was danger, wherever people needed help, Jackson and Ember would be there. Months later, a small statue was erected in the town square of Redwood Hollow. It depicted a firefighter kneeling beside a dog, their gazes fixed on an invisible threat in the distance. Beneath it, a plaque read, "In honor of those who faced the fire with courage, and the bonds that brought us through, Redwood Hollow will always remember." The statue became a place of reflection, a symbol of hope and resilience for the people of the town, and for anyone who heard the story of Jackson and Ember.